Hello, everybody. The intent of this video is to give you a bit of a recap on the last few weeks of our discussions in class and some of the homework that you've been doing. And I wanted to point out a few things. I'm going to be using a slide presentation here in just a few minutes that'll talk through some of the content with you. But I also wanted to point out that there are some notes for this presentation that if you were here in class with me, I'd be asking you to fill out as I go along with this presentation over several days. But what I've done here is I've loaded into Google Classroom for you your Gold Sheet 1 notes. Normally these are printed on gold paper and they'll have a 1 for every unit that we do. Obviously they're not gold here, they're white, but this is the notes that go along with this presentation. You don't have to fill anything out here. All you have to do is follow along with these notes. And this will give you some of the highlights and kind of break down this entire last few weeks for you in hopefully a very simple way and put together some of the key points that I've been trying to get across to you from a historical perspective, going really from influences of the early Europeans and all the way through the colonies here. So I'm going to talk to you about a few topics here. The expectation here is that you watch this, follow along with me, and use the notes as I'm talking to also kind of see where I'm at in the notes. And so I'll point out a few things to you here that are important for you to kind of remember. Are these testable items? Yes, they are testable items. You might see some of these concepts or questions on a exam in the future, okay? So this is one of those lectures where you want to pay attention. After you watch this lecture, if you have any questions about it, we can discuss it in class. You can also send me an email and talk to me about it. So without any further delays, just jump into this. We've got to define some words here first in this unit, which we haven't really done. So let's do them really quick. When we talk about what a colony is a settlement that's really far away from the government that rules it, right? If we use the term having to do with the government or government officials and decisions made about the country, we call that something that's related to politics or it's political in nature. A group of people who created and enforced their own rules or laws. These are related to, let's see here, self-government, related to like the Mayflower Compact probably. The lawmaking group of Great Britain, in the past it shared power with the king. Hopefully you'll know that that's Parliament, right? Parliament. And let's see if I can drag any other ones out of behind this. I hope so. There's another one. Having power over someone or something. We call that having authority over them, right? Having authority. And then somewhere back here, sorry. I don't see if I can grab it. There it is. A renewed interest in something. This is related to a topic called the Great Awakening, and it has to do with revival, right? Revival. And last but not least, where are you? Come out, wherever you are. Someone who speaks for another. That's someone we call is a representative of someone else, right? So these are some key things. Take a look at these words and the definitions. These are kind of important in this discussion that we're going to have. If you need to pause and look at these right now, go ahead and pause. If not, we're going to move on. Government, the person who creates and enforces the rules and protects the settlement, state, or country. That's our government. The power to change or affect a person, event, or thing. That's influence over something or someone. And that's a renewed interest in something. And hopefully you'll know what a democracy is. A democracy is basically a form of government where the citizens choose their own leaders and create and enforce their own rules for themselves. That's known as a democracy. So we have a democracy in the United States. We have what's called a constitutional democracy. And in England, they have a constitutional monarchy, right? Okay. All right. So let's get to the topic at hand. What's happening in Europe before colonists came to America? We've actually had quite a bit of discussion about this. It starts really with the Magna Carta. If you remember that discussion in 1215, King John is essentially forced to sign this document. And that will begin a process where power will shift away from monarchs. Here's King John, and it will shift more into the hands of the barons or the noble class in Europe, right? So again, these freemen, better known as barons, had control of the land. They're going to gain some powers related to that because they're forcing the king to sign this document. So here is the big agreement. We want you to sign, King John. And then they say, well, this is a first, a king who must follow the law like everybody else. Yeah, the Magna Carta forced the king to be accountable, right? You'll be sharing power with the nobles now, Your Majesty. And of course, we know King John, based upon our discussions, was not very happy about that. In fact, he tries to go back on the agreement. And then the following year, he's not successful to do anything because, well, he dies of dysentery, right? And so the following year, he will die. By the way, Richard the Lionheart, the true king of England, will return to England after the Crusades to kind of find his kingdom kind of like in a mess. And that power has been given up by John, and power will never be returned. But Richard understands that it's something that has to be accepted because the barons are very adamant about that. So the key significance in your notes here is the Magna Carta is a document that the English nobles forced their king to sign in 1215, and it limited, right? Limited the king's power. And it said that the king had to obey laws like everybody else. That is the key point and the key concept behind the Magna Carta. It limits the king's power, right? So if I was to say, what's the phrase that pays? What is that term that's associated with the Magna Carta for this class? You would think of the Magna Carta as being, it limits king's power. Limits king's power. Another big event that's in your notes here is the Protestant Reformation. And if we go back and we think about Martin Luther and the start of the Protestant Reformation, people wanted to get rid of the corruption in the Catholic Church, right? They wanted to reform it. They wanted to change it. This is going to result in a split in Christian denominations. We're going to see Protestants break off from the Catholics, and it's going to create a whole new tree with all these different Christian faiths that start to branch out. Calvinists, Methodists. Later on, we're going to see, the King of England create his own church called the Anglican Church, right? The church loses a lot of its power over many aspects of people's lives as a result of this. And then a lot of religious wars break out. Christians fighting Christians, Protestants fighting Catholics, and so on. Okay. So here's our Martin Luther. He's posting his 95 thesis on the door of the universe or the church in Wittenberg, Germany. It's dividing the church because of what's happening. The church goes from being really strong and powerful over everybody's lives to becoming kind of weak over everybody's lives. Here's an interesting question. Which do you believe to be true about government? If we remember, what is government? Government is, let's go back to our definitions, the person who creates and enforces the rules and protects the citizens, states, or countries, right? That's what government is, people or persons. So, which do you believe to be true? Now, some of you might say, hey, the government makes decisions for the common good of the people. Maybe you're a very altruistic person and you believe that government as a whole is, meant to do good things. Sometimes the government makes decisions based on their own interest and desires for power. Maybe you think that. Maybe you think that people in government cannot always think of individual rights when making decisions that affect the whole country, right? Or maybe you're thinking, if the government is not doing its job well, then the people have a right to create a new government, right? If you're thinking from an Enlightenment thinker's perspective, like John Locke, you like the idea of D, right? Because if the government's not doing its job well, if it's not protecting our natural rights, then it's time to get rid of it. It's time to get rid of that government. It's time to replace it with something new, Because ultimately, John Locke would say, the government is there to serve our needs, not the other way around. right? So when we think about the influences of the Enlightenment, religious leaders, philosophers, scientists are going to start to change the way that people viewed Christianity and the role of government in society. People viewed the purpose of government was to serve the people, right? The individual's freedoms to find answers for themselves and not rely on people in positions of authorities like kings, queens, becomes the focal point, becomes the center of what Enlightenment thinking is about. Okay. So the influence of the Enlightenment is really important because people that come to the New World to populate the colonies, which is sort of the focus of our unit here, that is what they're bringing with them, is some kind of knowledge of this. John Locke says, I am John Locke, right? I believe that individuals have certain rights that government cannot violate. Governments are supposed to protect these rights to life, liberty, and property. And he's saying this, literally in the end of the 1600s. Rulers receive their right to govern from, he would say, they receive their rights to govern from God, their natural rights. And he would say, unjust rulers can be removed from power, right? In fact, they should be removed from power if they're unjust to the people that they're supposed to serve. This statement, a peaceful beginning of government all peaceful beginnings of government have been laid in the consent of the people. The key word to this is the word consent. And consent means to give your permission, right? If your parents say to you, I give my consent that you can stay out, past 10 o'clock tonight with your friends, that's what it means. It's permission. So all peaceful beginnings of government, Locke would say, have been laid in the permission of the people, right? The consent of the people to give the government the power to make decisions for them. And when it violates that privilege, then they should be removed. Okay. Another key topic in your notes, if you're following along here, is the English Bill of Rights. And so in the latter part, the end of the 1600s, there's a king by the name of James, King James of England, and there's going to be a little revolution that starts against him, led by a lot of kind of religious fanatics. And what they do, they basically give him an ultimatum and say, look, we're tired of you violating our individual rights, and you can be king or queen, but we want to have a group of people that represents the needs of the people, that is a voice of the people in our government. And we want to create something called a parliament. So again, if we go back to the beginning to our definitions, what is a parliament? It's the lawmaking group for Great Britain. In the past, it will share power with the king, right? So this group, this parliament, is going to be composed of two parts. One's called the House of Lords, made up of wealthy landowners, and the other is going to be called the House of Commons. People from non-landowning areas, they're elected for shorter periods of time than members of the House of Lords, right? What kind of power do you think Parliament would want? Well, they probably wanted to control the money, right? The treasury. They probably wanted to be able to make laws that were beneficial to the people or that would meet the needs of the people. They wanted to control the military. And they also wanted to make sure that there was justice, right? The court system. So the English Bill of Rights, this piece of paper signed by King James, gives a much more descriptive account of what people's individual rights are. It's written under the direction of those representatives that are part of Parliament, and it gives the people a lot more say, more so, way more so than the Magna Carta ever did, of what's going on in England. So end of the 1600s, colonists that are continuing to come to the New World, they're they know about the English Bill of Rights big time. Okay, but early Jamestown colonists and Plymouth colonists, the English Bill of Rights did not exist yet. So when we think about Jamestown colonists, we think about Plymouth colonists, they really felt like they were English citizens. Okay, they believed that they were English citizens. They probably, they were loyal to the English crown. They followed English law. They came here with all the ideas that England had, and they expected to be protected by England as well. So in your notes, the English Bill of Rights is an agreement that gave more power to Parliament, that's the English lawmaking body, than the King and Queen of England, right? People had rights and more control over the government. This is one of the keys to the English Bill of Rights, is it empowers the people. The phrase that pays for the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, is power to the people. Power to the people. That's the key. All right. So if we're thinking about what could be some other things that, what are some phrases that pays for these other things? Match the word on the left with the significance on the right. We would say the Protestant Reformation would probably be limit church's power, right? We would say that Magna Carta, you're probably thinking, I hope, limits king's power. If you're thinking about English Bill of Rights, that's power to the people. And if you're thinking alignment, you should be thinking C, questions the role of government. Okay, what is the role of government in society? That's the big piece there. Who spread the ideas of natural rights? Please tell me. Please tell me that you're thinking D. Yes, John Locke is the correct answer for that. John Locke is the idea who spreads the idea of natural rights. Which describes a social contract? Ooh, let's go back to the idea of Rousseau here. Rousseau, the government must protect the rights citizens. The government must make all decisions for citizens. All decisions for citizens. That's a tongue twister. Citizens must obey the laws. Do you think it's both A and C, or both B and C, or one of these that describes a social contract? If you're thinking A and C, which would be the answer would be D, then you'd be correct in this case. Okay? This is the key right here. A and C. All right. So those are European influences, right? These are some of the things that are happening that we talked about in the first 2 weeks of school, of what is influencing people in their thought process. So let's go to the Americas now. This is kind of an interesting map, I think, because it gives you kind of an idea of like, what did the world look like back in the early 1600s, late 1500s? North America was pretty much unexplored. Columbus is going to come down here into this area around 1492. He's going to plant a Spanish flag down here, right? And then exploration is going to really kick off. The Spanish are going to explore all over the place, right? And then we have also the English who are going to come across from England up here. And then they're going to start exploring too. But also, we got to mention, we have the French over here. They're going to come. Oh, let's go back to the Spanish really quick because they're coming out of Spain here. And then we've got another country that's really important in this discussion also, and that's the Dutch. The Dutch are going to be coming from over here, and they're going to be coming to the islands as well. And actually, the Dutch are responsible for establishing what we call today the city of New York. It wasn't called New York when the Dutch arrived. It was called New Amsterdam. Later on, the English would take it from them and rename it and call it New York. But this is, the whole key to this is it's a little bit like traveling to Mars today, because the time that it took to travel across the Atlantic Ocean in a ship at that point was, like two, sorry, I can't write with this very well, 2.5 months, right? I'm doing this with my mouse, so bear with me. It's like 2.5 months to travel across the Atlantic. It's a long time, okay? And it's traveling to a place that a lot of people didn't know what was here. So that's sort of the analogy that I'm making with you. So here we go. Travel time, 2 to 5 months one way, right? 2 to 5 months one way across, and therefore that's kind of the analogy. Again, we've got several countries that are involved in populating this area. We've got the English, we've got the French, and we've got the Spanish. These are all the superpowers of this time frame of Europe, and they're populating and exploring these parts of North America, right? And this is the areas that they're sort of exploring into. The French come up the St. Lawrence River right here to populate North America and explore it, really. They weren't really populating it. They were looking for fur. That was what they were really looking for. The Spanish are coming here. They're looking for gold and silver. They're still in that mercantile or mercantilist attitude. Gold and silver makes us strong. The English are a little bit different, though. They're coming here and they're sending colonists for wealth, like we see in Jamestown initially, but they're also just sending colonists out of England to get them out of England. Like a lot of these people that were very religious, kind of fanatics, they called them, or fanatic is somebody who's like really hardcore believing in something. They were kicking them out of England and sending them over to the New World because they didn't want to deal with them in England because their views were just too out there. They were too radical. So when we talk about Plymouth Colony, which you guys studied a little bit in week number 3, and we think about what happened that makes the Plymouth Colony so special, is that they're going to sign an agreement while they're on their ship, the Mayflower, before they ever actually leave the ship and actually go out and actually establish themselves in what is the present state of Massachusetts, right? So they said England is too far away. We have to work together and make our own laws. And therefore, what do? This has never been done in North America before, but ultimately they decide to create what's the beginning of a democracy, right? Where the people will have a vote, the men will have a vote anyway, and they'll make decisions based upon a vote, and that's how they'll do this, okay? So the first written document about North America is sort of the significance here of the Mayflower Compact. And it creates an organized self-government. That is the real key to this, is it's an organized form of self-government, okay? It's the first written form of government in North America by English, all right, by the English. So when we think about how this document impacts the overall sort of government of the New World, or what will become America later, we start to see the beginnings of government through this document early on in 1620. So the phrase that pays for the Mayflower Compact, the phrase that pays is, "We make the rules." That's how you can remember what's important about the Mayflower Compact. This small group of 100 plus colonists, they all agree to the rules of who's going to be their leader, how they're going to enforce law, English law, who's going to be, who's going to be the person who punishes those who break the law, and they're going to put this together, and it's really going to work quite well. It's going to create some organization and some form of government for a group of people who weren't even, they were literally 2 to 5 months away from England, and nobody was going to come there to rescue them. So this is an interesting question that I want you to think about, right? Why do you think people would choose to come here? And I hope, because you've done some of the assignments already, that you can come up with some reasons why. They're probably not a lot different, the reasons why early colonists came here, as why anyone, even in 2020, would want to immigrate to the United States. Maybe it was because of to get rich, right? To make a better living for your family. Um, Maybe it's for religious freedom. Maybe you're being persecuted back where you live. Maybe you come here because there's other family members here. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that we could probably come up with of why anyone would want to come to the United States. This is, some would say this is a land of opportunity, right? It's a land where you can come here with nothing and you can make something of your life if you work hard, you know, if you follow the law and you treat people well. And at least that's ideally, I think, sort of the message here. And that's kind of what I want you to think about is it's not a huge difference of why people maybe came here back in, 1600, 1608 versus why they might come here today. Economic opportunity, religious freedom, maybe social justice issues, things like that. So in your notes, here's a few other things to think about. I kind of just outlined them here for you. Why do we think people came to the colonies back in 1610, 1620? Well, we kind of know why, because they told us when they wrote their diaries and their journals. A lot of them came here to make money. They were poor where they were at and they wanted to have an opportunity to make money. The second reason is they wanted to own land. Land equals success in the eyes of an early colonist because land produces resources, whether it's crops, wood to raise animals on. Maybe you get land and you look for mineral resources like gold or silver. Some people would even say that today, when we think about how do we judge whether somebody is successful or not, you might say, well, they own their own house, right? They have a house. That could be like a sign of that they've made it in the world, right? And I think that's been sort of America's sort of character throughout its history, is that to own land was a sign that you were successful. Certainly we know, and you know this from a lot of reading about the Plymouth Pilgrims, that a lot of them came here for their religious freedom. But a lot of people also came here to pay off debts that they had back in England, right? They had to come here to work. They had to come here as indentured servants, right? Indentured servants, somebody who has to pay off a debt. So they work for somebody for a period of time, 5, 8 years, whatever, and then they pay off that debt through their labor. And then, of course, we can't not mention this, but slaves. People came here as slaves. And some of the earliest slaves were actually a part of those early colonial colonists. We're going to talk later about slavery in this class. We'll talk about some of the early origins of slavery, but we start to see slaves here in the early 1600s. They came here and they were put to work. They were meant to be laborers. This is an outline of Jamestown, and this diagram is meant to sort of give you an idea of how Jamestown was constructed. It was constructed as a fort, and it was meant to be defended on 3 sides. You know, based on our discussion, that Jamestown was not the best place to actually build a fort. It was built basically in a swamp area, but it was designed to be defended, right? We have parapets, or areas that are raised above the ground, like on like a hill, and each part of these was a parapet. Now, what this is shows you how the river, the James River, has shifted over time. And now, if you were to go to Jamestown, the corners of Jamestown would probably be in the river at this point, because over time the river has moved, right? Like topography moves things, it changes, and so we know what Jamestown pretty much looked like because archaeologists have dug up the site and we found remains of the actual settlement itself. All right. When we think about colonial America, we think about it as a group of colonies that are divided up into 13 parts. Okay? That's why they're called the 13 colonies. And we further divide them up. So we divide them up into three parts. That is the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. But then they're also divided up individually into what's called colonies, which will later become states, by the way. Okay. So let's have a little discussion about what is the significance of these three parts, because it does have an important impact later on when we have a discussion about how the nation starts to grow and change, and how these geographical areas, New England, middle, and southern, how they influence a lot of things. Here is a picture of the boundaries of the original 13 colonies. So as time goes on, from 1608 until literally the beginning of the American Revolution, which will happen in 1776, excuse me, we see that there's areas along the eastern part of the North American coastline that are divided up into political boundaries. Okay. Georgia down here, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia colony, and here's where Jamestown settlement was. Another settlement that's going to be really important in the development of the colonies is called Williamsburg. We've got Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York City, most of you have probably heard of. When it was originally established, I mentioned earlier, was called New Amsterdam. It was controlled by the Dutch, but then there was a war between the Dutch and the English, and then the Dutch ended up giving up New Amsterdam to England, and it's renamed New York after the Duke of York. And then we've got Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and this part up here will be a part of Massachusetts actually for a very long time, until the middle part of the 1800s, when it will be turned into another state called Maine later on. Now the New England colonies, pretty much where you see this area here, where Connecticut, Rhode Island are, the type of government they had was called a representative legislature. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this, and you're going to read more about this, but basically it was a representative form of government where people were chosen by members of the colonies of New England to represent them, but it was based on an English model. Okay, so they were still, at this point, still loyal to the English crown, and they were still using English law. The type of economy that they had was called a God and cod economy. So religion and the cod fishing industry. There's a video that is available for you to watch, and I want you to watch it as a part of this week's work about the cod fishing industry. Cod is a really important school fish that for many, many decades was super plentiful off the coast of New England. And cod is a white meat fish that's really mild, but there's stories that you could literally walk out into the ocean and just pick cod out of the ocean with your hands. There were so many of them. Today, the cod industry has pretty much been decimated by overfishing, and cod is not something that you can just go find anywhere anymore. But it is still out there, but it's really hard. But cod was used, it was salted, and it was sent back to England as a food source. And we'll talk more about that, of why cod, or the cod fishing industry, was so important to early colonies. The middle colonies also had a representative legislature. So you see here where we have New York, and we go down here to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and this area here. These colonies also had a representative legislature. So they had people that represented the population. They spoke on their behalf and made decisions on their behalf. They were elected. And they had a trade and agricultural economy. Okay. So they were manufacturers. They made furniture. They were like artisans, but they also grew crops. In fact, Pennsylvania is one of the great agricultural states even today of the United States. And then the third sort of description is the southern colonies, right? Down here. And we've got basically everywhere from Maryland through Virginia all the way through the Carolinas. And that was a different kind of government, actually. That was not a representative legislature. That was a government that was based on governors being chosen by England to serve as the leaders of these colonies on what's called a royal charter, right? So this was a lot of land, honestly, during the colonial period that was owned by very wealthy English people. And people that came here to colonize had to answer to governors who reported basically to Parliament or to the King of England directly. Okay. And there wasn't a lot of debate or discussion. It was pretty much an iron fist of how things were ruled, and the governor had all the power. Trade was also a part of this economy, but the primary form of making money in the southern colonies was large scale agriculture. Okay. And the reason why that is because the soil and the climate is really good for growing crops like tobacco, cotton, indigo, things that really sold up really well in European markets. So when we think about the South and what they did, how they made money, growing crops was their primary form of making money because the climate and the soil were fantastic. So you should be able to, if I was to give you a map, look at the eastern coast and kind of tell me what area does this represent right here. So this area represents, hopefully you would say, the middle colonies, right? That's New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Representative legislature is their form of government, and trade and agriculture are their ways of making money. There's a mountain range that separates the 13 colonies from the rest of the continent. And if you notice, if I go back here to this slide, you'll notice that it's listed right here along this slide. And this mountain range is called the Appalachian Mountains. And it's a really, really important mountain range. In fact, it runs all the way along here. But it actually was a barrier to expansion for a long time for the colonies to grow west. And this is going to be an important issue later on when we talk about how colonies grow or don't grow. Okay. So the Appalachian Mountains will be critical in creating a barrier between colonists that are populating and coming over here from Europe and the Native Americans who are being pushed to the west into the mountains right here. As time goes on, colonists are going to want to cross these mountains. And when that happens, it creates a lot of problems between Native Americans and colonists to the point where there's a war that started called the 7 Years' War between Native Americans and colonists. All right. So let's see here. Let's take a look at a couple of these questions. So what mountain range was it that was a barrier between the colonies and the rest of what we call America? It was the Appalachians, which is not a reason why people came to the colonies. Which is not a reason. Well, we know they wanted religious freedom, many people write, so that can't be the answer. Were some forced to come and be slaves here? Sure. Did some of them want to own their own land and start businesses? Absolutely. They were capitalists, right? They were hardcore capitalists. How about, did some just want to fight Native Americans because they wanted to pick a fight? Not really. Nobody came here just with the idea to pick a fight with Native Americans. So number 3 is the correct answer here. This is not why people came. They were not interested in confrontation. Though they had confrontation, that's not why they came here. All right, we'll skip this one. How did the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights influence colonist political ideas? Well, colonists wanted representation in government. That's true. We see that in the representative legislatures that they had. Colonists wanted their own king in the colonies? No, they really didn't want a king here, especially after they got here. They found that they really didn't need the king that much. Colonists did not want any type of government. They wanted government. In fact, we see this with the Plymouth Pilgrims, right? They They signed the Mayflower Compact. They were interested in government. Colonists wanted to join the Native American way of life? No, no. The best answer here is, they wanted number one, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation. All those things influenced people to want representative government. Why was the Mayflower Compact significant? Well, it was the first document in America, right, about self-government. That's why it's important. It's what represents the beginning of democracy in the New World. All right, so we'll stop here. And the next portion of this lecture, when we pick back up, is going to be about the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, which is a part of your homework, actually, your assignment in week 4 this week. So when we pick back up, when I come back to this lecture, we'll pick back up here, and we'll talk about the Enlightenment, or not the Enlightenment, sorry, the Great Awakening. Okay? All right. Thanks so much for listening. And again, hopefully you followed along with your notes and you were able to gain some insight on this. See you later.